Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the webinar 50 Years of Cooperation, Cuba CARICOM Relations. This is a joint initiative of the IIR and CARICOM in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean on December 1972. Next week, on December the 6th, in Barbados, the 8th Cuba CARICOM Summit will take place. Important issues in the area of trade, climate change, health, and education should be discussed. And with the webinar that we are developing today, we would like to contribute to the necessary reflection about Cuba and CARICOM cooperation relationship and how it could be expanded and improved. So thank you so much to all of you to join us today, and welcome again. Before proceeding to the presentations of our distinguished panelists, I would like to invite Dr. Montut, Director of the Institute of International Relations at the University of the West Indies, to deliver welcome remarks on behalf of the Institute of International Relations. Please, Dr. Montut.
Thank you, Chair. Dignitaries from the CARICOM Secretariat, Your Excellencies, distinguished panelists, colleagues, and staff of the Institute of International Relations, attendees, friends of the IIR, good evening. It is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar, 50 Years of Cooperation, Cuba CARICOM Relations, being hosted with our partner, the CARICOM Secretariat. In keeping with the mandate of the Institute of International Relations, every year, we host various kinds of events intended to promote discussion and exchange of ideas with officials, practitioners, experts, students, and the general public on issues of relevance to international relations and regional development. Importantly, these public events give the IIR's work a regional reach, promote its public presence, generate knowledge, and advance the policy relevance of its work. Many of these events are executed collaboratively with individuals and a wide range of organizations, including research and policy bodies, think tanks, national and regional governmental and non-governmental organizations. These partnerships highlight, among many things, the multidisciplinary nature of the IIR's work and its ability to bridge the gap between theory, policy, and practice. On this occasion, we are particularly pleased to collaborate with the CARICOM Secretariat in keeping with this broad vision. 50 years ago, in December of 1972, the heads of government of the independent nations of Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Barbados defiantly established diplomatic relations with Cuba in the face of a US dictate politically and economically isolating the island. The Caribbean leaders held fast to their position and championed the island's sovereignty and right to self-determination. It is against this critical backdrop and in anticipation of CARICOM's own momentous 50th anniversary next year that we found it crucial to examine the relationship forged with one of its most important allies in the region over time. The true essence of CARICOM, its aspiration towards autonomous Caribbean regional integration, included from inception the achievement of economic and social development for all Caribbean people. It is no small feat that Caribbean's founding fathers resisted the US to ensure that Cuba was not neglected in this equation. Cuba itself, a bastion of resistance and resilience against the prevailing power structure, equally set great store by its relationship with CARICOM, contributing to the region's development in all sectors. Emanating from its own political philosophy and socialist ideals, Cuba's initiatives throughout the region have touched every aspect of development, from health and medicine to education, trade, and climate change research. Commemorating the importance of this deeply interconnected relationship is by no means an easy task, particularly as historically the trajectory of the ties between CARICOM and Cuba has been impacted both negatively and positively by regional economic and political turbulence and the shifting geopolitical tides over time. As we begin The IR would like to pay special attention to and salute CARICOM's consistent pursuit of finding innovative, integrating pathways to achieving the development goals of the Caribbean region and securing a more productive and secure path for all Caribbean states. In this regard, the CARICOM Secretariat's collaboration with the IR to organize this event is an extension of that commitment to Caribbean fortification of its values. On behalf of the IR, I therefore extend many thanks to Ambassador Ford and the CARICOM Secretariat for the opportunity to collaborate and bring this webinar to life. We look forward to our joint events to celebrate CARICOM's 50th anniversary next year. Finally, I would like to thank our panelists and attendees for their interest and participation and the many persons whom Ms. Charles will thank on our behalf in the vote of thanks. I hope you enjoy this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montoute, for your welcome remarks. I would like now to invite the panelists to start the presentations section. First, I would like to introduce each panelist, and I would like to remind that we will have presentations between 10 and 15 minutes. I would also like to invite our attendees to share your questions and comments in the chat. First, our first panelist is coming from Cuba, and we are very happy to introduce former Ambassador Jose Francisco Piedra Rencurrel, who is a Cuban diplomat and researcher with more than 30 years of experience in international relations. He has served in diplomatic missions in 5 countries, among them Jamaica, where he was ambassador for 6 years. Ambassador Piedra Rencurrel has been professor for about a decade at the University of Havana and at the Institute of Sports and Physical Culture Manuel Fajardo. He has also worked as consultant and analyst for the Cuban television. Ambassador Piedra has sent us a video, and we are going to share his remarks now with this pre-recorded video that we have.
Hi, good evening. Greetings from Havana, Cuba. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Institute of International Relations of the U.W.I. for the brilliant idea to call to this webinar for commemorating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relation between Cuba and CARICOM. I would also like to thank Doctors Anita Montoute and Jacqueline LaGuardia for the kind invitation extended to me to participate in this important academic event. I also extend my appreciation to the CARICOM General Secretariat and to the rest of the sponsors who have made possible this seminar. I would also like to convey my warmest greetings to my fellow colleague speakers this evening. With some of them, I have had the opportunity to chair Caribbean and academic and diplomatic events years before. To all, my gratitude for having me this evening at this seminar. Challenge. Talking about the 5 decades of Cuba's relations with the nations of the Caribbean community in a short period of time is not an easy task, but I will try to present a tight synthesis of which I consider more relevant from the grateful vision of Cuba. Historical context. I think that before go through the main subject of the paper, we have to put in context which were the main characteristics of the events happening around Cuba at the end of the decade of the 60s or the beginning of the 70s. First of all, we have to take in consideration the isolation of Cuba from the rest of the hemisphere due to decisions taken in the OES and which came to an end expelling Cuba from the organization. Second one, and not less important than the previous, is the establishment and the intensification of the economical, financial, and commercial blockade imposed from the United States on the Cuban people, and which lasted for more than 60 years, as everybody knows very, very well. But at the same time of these two issues, also in Cuba, the Cuban people was building its spirit of unity, solidarity, sovereignty, and the idea of the independence was every passing day getting force in the minds and the brains of the Cuban people and the unity around its leadership. I think that this is important to mention at this moment, the solidarity, because it is one of the main characteristics of the Cuban foreign policy. And I think that in the Caribbean is a real expression of this solidarity expressed by Cuba for many, many years, and not only to the Caribbean people, but also to the peoples of other regions of the world. I think that the decision taken by Barbados, Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago on December the 8th, 1972, it was a transcendent one. It was a very important one because it was a decision taken for a group, and a small group of small nations, geographically speaking, but with a high values of love and recognizing towards Cuba. I don't have time in this brief presentation to talk about the historical links, cultural, affective links, sentimental links between the people of Cuba and the people of the Caribbean. Only mention that the presence of the great Caribbean immigration in Cuba at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, that came to Cuba to work in the sugarcane fields and in other spheres. And this allowed to have a mix of relation, family relation that lasted till today. I think that the decision, it was a transcendental one because it was far beyond the mere fact to establish diplomatic relations with one country. It only was, the courageous decision, it also was a decision which impact strongly the rest of the Latin American countries. Because as I always said that the decision taken for Jamaica, Barbados, Guyana, and Trinidad and Tobago allow many others to assume similar stance after 1972. And it have to do with the way openly by these four countries as an example to the others who feel free to reestablish diplomatic relations with Cuba. So it is an expression of unity, and it was an impact on the unity of the region, not only of the Caribbean. I don't have any doubt that this was a victory of Caribbean in favor of Cuba, but it was also a victory of the Caribbean in the full region and in the hemisphere. Briefly, I have to go now through the state of relations. Bilaterally, Cuba's ties with its Caribbean sister can be shown as an example of South-South cooperation. No doubt about that. I think that everybody have to recognize that the exemplarity of the relation that Cuba with their sister Caribbean nation has with CARICOM. For Cuba, the firm, forceful, and reiterated position of CARICOM rejecting the blockade, which, as I told, has lasted for more than 60 years, represents a source of pride and gratitude. Likewise, the expressions of solidarity and brotherhood towards the Cuban people expressed in various international meetings and even in meetings at the highest level of Caribbean leaders with their peers from other countries. In these 50 years, relations of a political diplomatic nature has been strengthened with concrete expressions in high-level visits, for instance. Also, in the various several cooperations agreements signed between Cuba and the CARICOM nations, and in the creation of effective consultation mechanisms such as the Cuba-CARICOM summits, whose next meeting will be in Barbados in a few days ahead, precisely to commemorate the 50th anniversary of these relations. Cuba feels honored when we appreciate today that in various sectors and spheres of Caribbean societies, there are graduates of Cuban educational centers who performs prominently in politics, government, health, education, sports, and other fields. Believe me that many of them are still well connected with Cuba and its people, and we Cubans modestly feel proud of that. On the other hand, the highest Cuban political leadership has reiterated its fraternal commitment and solidarity with the Caribbean brothers, since Fidel Castro, who was inspired the will to develop ties with the Caribbean as much as possible, like Army General Raúl Castro, who has openly defended Caribbean law to compensation for the damage caused by slavery and colonialism, as well as President Díaz-Canel, a faithful follower of those leaders and those ideas. I don't allow myself to finish this brief presentation without mentioning a person and a figure who was instrumental in the strengthening of the relation between Cuba and its sister from CARICOM. I am referring to the late Ambassador Lázaro Cabezas, who was a man who he was called for many of the Caribbean friends as a CARICOM man. He was really a person who dedicated a lot of effort for the better understanding, the friendship, and the brotherhood between Cuba and its sister of the Caribbean. I thank you very much.
Well, we would like to thank Ambassador Piedra for his remarks from Cuba. And now I would like to invite our next panelist. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Mark Kirton, who is a citizen of Guyana and Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin, the United States. His professional experience spans more than 4 decades of university teaching, research, and administration. At the University of Guyana, he served as senior lecturer and head of the Department of Political Science and Law, and head of the Graduate School of the Social Science and Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. Dr. Kirton later joined the University of the West Indies and served as director of the Institute of International Relations, from where he retired. Dr. Kirton's current research interests include regional integration, Latin American politics and government, and migration and human security. Please, Dr. Kirton, you might proceed to present, and welcome again to our seminar.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dr. Martinez. I join with my colleague presenter in congratulating the Institute of International Relations and the CARICOM Secretariat for sponsoring this webinar, a very important event in the context of the Caribbean and its development of relations with Cuba. I also want to thank the Institute for inviting me to participate, and to say to my fellow presenters that it's indeed a pleasure to interact with each of you again after such a long time. I look at the beginnings of the relationship and argue that contextually, we recognize that there have been linkages between the peoples of the Caribbean and the people of Cuba even before the 1960s. As a matter of fact, when Ambassador spoke of the linkages which emerged as Caribbean nationals migrated to Cuba to participate in the development of the agricultural sector and to work in the sugar plantations, that link began long before this period. Additionally, one must recognize that in the 1960s, as we started to move towards independence and decolonization in the English-speaking Caribbean, that was a significant period in the history of the small states of the region. And by the mid and end of the 1960s, we saw the emergence of inter-party relations. In the case, for example, of my own country of birth, Guyana, we saw the People's Progressive Party in the 1960s having fraternal linkages with the Communist Party of Cuba. And also we saw when Premier Cheddi Jagan of then British Guyana was in active consultation with President Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara in thinking about some of the developmental efforts which would emerge in the 1970s. Even in the early 1970s, even before the actual December 1972 very important activity which led to the final and formal link in terms of the relationship between Cuba and CARICOM. Cuba participated in CARIFESTA I in Guyana in August 1972. And we saw, therefore, the emergence of a cultural engagement with the Caribbean. The linkages here starting to fructify, to move forward in the cultural sphere even before the final signing of the interactive engagement and formal declaration of relations. So we can say here that the beginnings were even important in this period. As we go to the next slide, we talk about the era of initial engagement and look at some of the successes and challenges. They have been significant. In 1972, as we mentioned, there was a strong level of discussion at all levels and the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica in a very historic event on the 8th of September, 1972. This, to me, was a very important Caribbean contribution to move Cuba from a level of diplomatic and economic isolation in the hemisphere, especially in the context of an environment in which the small states of the Caribbean some of them were not independent. The 4 that were independent were in a situation in which the Cold War had emerged and there was pressure. And so we saw a very important decision, significant for small states, being made to move forward in this process of removing, I would say, diplomatic isolation in the hemisphere. So that, to my mind, was a significant initial success in this process. One must also consider that here we had, that was even before the formal establishment of CARICOM. CARICOM and the Treaty of Chaguaramas emerged in 1973. And so one could say here that in 1972, that was the beginning of one of the pillars which emerged in the Caribbean community set of principles. The issue related to the coordination of foreign policy. And I think that when you looked at late 1972, even before the advent of CARICOM officially, we saw that important step to coordinate foreign policy being articulated and operationalized. And especially when one saw that by 1973, CARICOM, some of the small states of the Caribbean were participating alongside Cuba in the non-aligned movement. And I recall that while symbolic, the presence of President Castro taking along with him on the same flight, then Prime Minister Burnham and Prime Minister Manley of Jamaica to the non-aligned conference in Algiers, that, while symbolic, was, I think, an important recognition of the kind of interaction, the kind of shared vision, the kind of engagement and solidarity which has symbolized the relationship ever since that time. We also saw in the 1970s the Cuban support in human resource development in the small states of the Caribbean. One has to recognize again that the small states of the region were emerging, transitioning to independence. They were challenged in relation to training in significant areas, medicine, science and technology. And the Cuban support in that period and thereafter became, I think, also important and critical in terms of Caribbean development. In the 1970s also, in 1975, we saw the establishment of the Caribbean Development and Cooperation Committee, RECLAC, which I think brought about the enhancement of this partnership so they can share ideas, so the states of the region under the UN umbrella, under the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, the small states of the Caribbean and Cuba were in a position to interact directly in hammering out possible solutions to economic development in the midst of vulnerability, which was a factor which impacted the Caribbean and still does in some senses the region. We saw medical brigades from Cuba present in the Caribbean to fill gaps in knowledge and to share with the people of the region that type of proletarian internationalist support, which was necessary in the transition to independence in the region. Next slide. So we also looked at there's some of the challenges. There was concern, indeed, in the hemisphere. Many of the states of Latin America were military authoritarian states. And we saw them concerned about this emergence of a strong linkage between the small states of the region and Cuba. I remember 1975, when Latin American concerns were raised about the Cuban aircraft refueling in Guyana en route to support the liberation struggle in Angola when they landed to refuel in Georgetown. Actually, I remember the Brazilian military regime actively engaging in notes verbal and active concern about that development. And it showed, to my mind, a spirit of collaboration and cooperation, widened not only with Cuba at this stage, but also with the struggles of the peoples of Southern Africa. It is, to my mind, it was the first act of terrorism in 1976, which I call another challenge to relationship. When we saw 11 Guyanese among 73 Cuban and other nationals killed in the bombing of an aircraft, CU-455, off of Barbados. And so that took, to my mind, consolidated the view that this was a strong level of solidarity that had to be an engagement that had to be retained among the people of the region. And while it was a challenge, I think it offered us an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of solidarity and unity, which I think are still present in our contemporary time. Next slide. One could also recognize that there were pushbacks, there were challenges. We saw the Cuban engagement in Grenada as Grenada chose a pathway to development of its people with the full support of the Cuban people. And by 1983, we saw the US intervening in Grenada, which had an impact on Caribbean-Cuba relations in the sense that we saw some Caribbean states actively supporting the intervention of the United States at the United Nations and other fora, which I think split or had an impact on some of the solid relations within the Caribbean at that point in time. So one could say here that as Cuba moved to support development, we also saw linkages, some of the linkages are threatened by US influence. While this engagement in the 1980s was slowed, we saw between the 1990s and the 21st century a rebirth, a re-engagement. One could argue here that the end of the Cold War, the emergence of common challenges, a recognition of the need for strategies and the development of new synergies emerged. We saw in 1993 the establishment of the Caribbean-Cuba Commission, and by 1993, all of the Caribbean states voted at the United Nations General Assembly in favor of the removal of the embargo against Cuba. I saw that as a very important coming together, the rethink, the re-engineering in a sense, and the re-engagement in favor of a very strong level of solidarity with the people of Cuba at that time. In 1995, as a result of the West Indian Commission report, we saw the establishment of the Association of Caribbean States, with all countries washed by the Caribbean Sea, including Cuba, eligible for membership. And I think that too provided another forum for interaction and cooperation, which emerged then and is still strong at this stage. By the beginning of the 21st century and the era of new regionalism and the proliferation of integration arrangements in the region, we saw engagement at the political and economic level develop. There was, for example, the first meeting in 2008 in Brazil for the first time, where Caribbean and Latin American leaders met without the presence of the United States and Canada, which led in 2010 to the establishment of CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. Even before then, as we saw some Caribbean states being part of the ALBA, the Alliance for the Peoples of the Alianza, what's called, I'm losing my train of thought here, but in 2004, the ALBA was formed. And we saw some Caribbean states emerging as members. And I think that too, that engagement also allowed for higher levels of interaction at the economic level, brought states closer together. And I believe that too, as a part of the region integration effort, generated new levels of interest and cooperation, which are still present in today's world. I would also say that, and the next slide would help me a little bit. I would say that today we see some other achievements, a continued support for the health sector. There is the Cuban medical training of graduates and specialists in areas which the Caribbean can now develop, and to treat patients and diseases which in the past only allowed for that kind of treatment to be done externally. We've seen common interests emerge: food security, environment, and climate change. And I think those are important activities which have to be both promoted and sustained. Food security in the context of both acquisition and development, food security. We see here issues related to the food chain, access at low cost to the peoples of the region. And my view is that the level of collaboration ought to be increased to ensure that we reduce the food bill in the region, the food import bill, and ensure that there could be cheaper food available to the people of the wider Caribbean. The environment, I think, is also an important and critical component of development. And one speaks about climate change, the regularity and intensity of climate change events which have emerged and impacted the region, and which I believe we see collaboration emerging among states of the region and Cuba. The Caribbean is a zone of peace. Here we see still some outstanding areas of controversy. We see still the Venezuela-Guyana issue. And while it's at the level of the ICJ, one could argue here for a second-tier diplomatic effort to ensure that the levels of solidarity among the peoples remain intact. So that we talked about the medical brigade and support for CARICOM. And especially important was the Cuban contribution in the COVID pandemic across the region of its medical personnel. We've seen also SEDEMA, which is the Disaster Management Agency for the Caribbean, having linkages now with Cuba to develop the kind of response mechanisms which are necessary. And I think that would be an important component as we move forward in the collaboration, especially given the increasing levels of disaster which demand early responses. We've seen Cuba provide, I think, an important set of resources for the establishment of a center in Guyana, but for the region, to stimulate the development of children and young people with special needs. And I think that is in recognition of the kind of thinking about the empowerment of youth in the region, which must be highly commended. And that I think that augurs well for further collaboration between Cuba and the Caribbean. So as I come to my conclusions, I believe that we've seen a very momentous decision in 1972. It signaled a high level of solidarity, engagement. We've seen where the symmetry which emerged have ensured that we have stronger bonds of friendship. We've seen a shared commitment. We've seen sustainable engagement and 21st century regionalism as the catalyst for greater Caribbean-Cuban engagement. And I want to thank you for, although I rambled, I thought that it was very important to bring some of these issues to the fore. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirton, for your presentation. And I would like to invite now Ambassador David Commission to share his remarks. Before I will introduce Ambassador Commissioning, who was born in the Caribbean island of St. Vincent. He's a former senator in the government of Barbados and is currently Barbados Ambassador to the Caribbean community and to the Association of Caribbean States. He is also a founder member of the Caribbean Pan-African Network, the Clement Payne Movement of Barbados, the Caribbean chapter of the International Network in Defense of Humanity, and the Global African Congress, and was an architect and the first director of the Barbados government's Commission for Pan-African Affairs. He represented the Caribbean region at the 7th Pan-African Congress in Uganda, played a key role in the United Nations World Conference Against Racism in South Africa, and has represented the diaspora on the African Union's Economic, Social, and Cultural Council. Since the year 2012, Mr. Commissioning has served as a member of Barbados National Task Force on Reparation. Please, Ambassador Commissioning, you can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. LaGuardia, and thank you, Dr. Montoute, and the Center for International Relations for inviting me to participate in this very important event. Our comrade from Cuba began this session by invoking the name of Lázaro Cabezas, and I too would like to dedicate this little talk to the memory of Ambassador Lázaro Cabezas, who was the ambassador who established the Cuban embassy right here in Barbados. I would also like to invoke the memory of two Barbadian and Caribbean greats that we lost this year, who were very instrumental in building the relationship with Cuba. And I refer to George Lamming and my comrade, Bobby Clark. Now, the first point I think we should make is that if you examine the foreign policy of Cuba, you will probably come to the determination that CARICOM is perhaps Cuba's #1 foreign policy priority. And you just have to look at the number of Cuban embassies that are to be found in the CARICOM region. There's virtually an embassy in almost every CARICOM member states. And for us in CARICOM, Cuba is most definitely a foreign policy priority. And Cuba is such a priority for us because we are interested in building our Caribbean civilization. We are interested in building our pan-Caribbean economy, trade and system, and our integration mechanism within our Caribbean sphere. And clearly, Cuba, the island of Cuba, is approximately 1/3 of the landmass of the Caribbean. In addition, the population of Cuba is approximately 1/3 of the population of our Caribbean region. And in light of its size and the unique historical processes that Cuba has found itself engaged in, Cuba has developed strengths in the fields of science and technology beyond the development in our Caribbean countries. And so we look to Cuba as a bulwark in this sphere of science, technology, and production capacity. In addition, Cuba is very important to us because Cuba is, in a sense, a litmus test of our independence, our self-determination, and our sense of self-respect. You know, anytime we feel the need to justify to ourselves or to others our sense of dignity and sovereignty, one of the things that we constantly go back to in the Caribbean is that decision that our leaders took in Chaguaramas in October of 1972 to consciously defy the United States government and the Organization of American States, which were demanding that Cuba be isolated, and to take that very principled step of recognizing Cuba and engaging in all kinds of relations with Cuba. And we have maintained that self-respect down through the years, and it is manifested, of course, in our annual vote at the UN General Assembly for the resolution condemning the US blockade and calling for it to be removed. And similarly, just as there are many Cuban embassies in our CARICOM countries, most CARICOM countries also possess embassies in Cuba. In fact, speaking for my own country of Barbados, the only Caribbean country in which Barbados has an embassy is Cuba. And that is the case for most CARICOM countries. There's also the fact of a cultural or social values affinity between CARICOM and Cuba. If you examine the value structure of CARICOM and Cuban societies, you would note that there is a similarity in respect for the ordinary human being, a belief in the worth and value of every single citizen, no matter how supposedly lowly that person might be. And this is because for us in the CARICOM countries, we are the product of an historical experience of slavery, where the majority of our population came from the very bottom of the society. We were all enslaved at the very bottom of that society. And so we have developed a sense of that human solidarity, a sense of commitment to the welfare of the least among ourselves. And Cuba similarly arrived at a similar values situation through the Cuban Revolution, through a process of revolution. Cuba today, after the revolution, Cuba is basically a working class society, a working class led society. And so, as has been mentioned before, because of those similarities, because we have prioritized each other, you will find that in the relationship between CARICOM and Cuba, there are elements that you scarcely find in any other CARICOM international relationship. For example, the 3-yearly CARICOM Cuba Heads of Government Summit. CARICOM has no such relationship with any other country in the world. The biannual CARICOM Cuba Foreign Ministers Conference. Similarly, we have no such practice with any other country in the world. And I can tell you that it is a staple of CARICOM coordinated or collective foreign policy. Solidarity with Cuba is a staple. I can recall one particular foreign ministers meeting when the Trump administration had just activated Chapter 3 of the Helms-Burton Law. And the CARICOM foreign ministers were passing a resolution denouncing this act by the Trump administration. And one particular government suggested that maybe the language was too strong and the language should be tempered. And the feeling in the room was people were aghast. And it was said to that particular foreign minister, but this is Cuba. This is Cuba. We give solidarity to Cuba. You know, it's a staple of CARICOM foreign policy, and it's a staple that we should feel very proud about. So yes, as a result of all of that, there are many areas in which we have established strong relations with Cuba, and some of them have been mentioned already, so I will not go over them. But my topic is opportunities and challenges for cooperation between Cuba and CARICOM. And we all know what is the greatest challenge to cooperation between Cuba and CARICOM. And of course, the greatest challenge is the existence of the United States, criminal United States blockade of Cuba, the illegal blockade, illegal in international law, and therefore it merits the description of criminal. This is the main hindrance in the further and deeper development of cooperation between Cuba and CARICOM. And this is why a big part of the foreign policy of CARICOM is to try to get that blockade terminated. And CARICOM does this by giving active solidarity to Cuba. As I said, every year we vote for the resolution. But approximately 2 years ago, the CARICOM foreign ministers made a determination that we were going to up the ante in our campaign against the blockade. And CARICOM's ambassadors in capitals like Washington and New York were going to be instructed to do more, to do as much as possible to remove that blockade. Our heads of government also penned a collective letter to President Joseph Biden. It was delivered privately, but explaining to him why that blockade was obsolete. It was an anachronism of the Cold War, and why we, in our own self-interest, needed that blockade to be removed. Not only was it unjust to the nation and people of Cuba, but it was an infringement. It was an unnatural obstacle to the further development of our Caribbean region. And so this is something that we have to continue to focus on. We know that under the Obama administration, there had been a relative loosening of the blockade, but the Trump administration intensified it, and the Biden administration has really done virtually nothing to relieve the pressure put on by the Trump administration. At the CARICOM Cuba summit next week in Barbados, it is expected that our heads of government will turn their attention to the blockade and what more can be done to secure the removal of the blockade. I expect that the government of Barbados for sure will be putting on the table for discussion a number of measures aimed at upping the ante in relation to the removal of the blockade. This attached to the blockade is also the fact that the Trump administration put Cuba on the list, the US State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And that rankles for us in Barbados because we were on the front line of that terrorist action on the 6th of October, 1976, when the Cubana airline was blown out of the territorial airspace of Barbados. The plane crashed into the waters of the Caribbean Sea, and Barbadian men and women were charged with retrieving those dismembered and mangled bodies. So we understand Cuba as being perhaps the world's #1 victim of terrorism, the world's #1 victim of state-sponsored terrorism even. And so we consider it an insult and a grave injustice for Cuba to be on anybody's list of state sponsors of terrorism. And so we will be coming with some strategies to see how that could be addressed. One of the things that we are likely to be putting on the table is the idea of having the 6th of October recognized within the Caribbean community as the CARICOM Day Against Terrorism, and making the point that Cuba has been historically a victim of terrorism. So I think that is the major stumbling block, the major hindrance in the relationship, in further cooperation, because it makes it difficult. That US embargo, that placement of Cuba on the US State Department's list of countries that sponsor terrorism make it very difficult to engage in trade and financial relationships with Cuba. And that to me is the biggest obstacle. But we need to bear in mind that in spite of that obstacle, and that obstacle of the blockade has been there for 60 years, in spite of that obstacle, we have done a lot of things together with Cuba. There was mention of the Regional Special Education Needs and Disability Diagnostic and Treatment Center. that is being established in Guyana. But there's also the U.W.I, University of Havana Center for Sustainable Development, that was established at the University of Havana in December of 2019. Of course, there are the scholarship programs, Operation Milagro. There's a Cuban Eye Care Center that was set up in St. Lucia. There is the initiative aimed at developing a Cuban Center for the Performing Arts in Jamaica. In the case of many Caribbean countries, I can speak about Barbados, there's all kinds of technical cooperation. Cuban sports coaches work and serve in Barbados in several sporting disciplines. Cuba has given technical assistance to our television station here in Barbados. Of course, the Cuban medical brigades. We have had a Cuban medical brigade in Barbados now since April of 2020. At present, we have approximately 70 nurses in Barbados. And yes, and maybe we can go on and on. In spite of the blockade, we have managed to accomplish quite a bit. And so the question is, how do we, in spite of the blockade, how do we further intensify that collaboration? And on Monday of next week, we will have a Barbados-Cuba bilateral meeting. President Diaz-Canel and Prime Minister Motley and their teams will meet on Monday, and we will be discussing Barbados-Cuba bilateral cooperation. And I can tell you that there are many areas in which we are going to be seeking enhanced cooperation with Cuba in the field of biotechnology, trade, technical cooperation and trade in agriculture, collaboration in the development of the creative sector and industries, ongoing collaboration in the health sector, but very importantly as well, Barbados has determined that the collaboration and cooperation and giving has to be a two-way street. So, for example, we have benefited from the Cuban scholarship program over many years. Prime Minister Motley has offered 10 scholarships to our Cuban brothers and sisters at tertiary level institutions in Barbados. Similarly, Cuba has offered to help Barbados in teaching Spanish as a second language, and Barbados will be reciprocating by offering assist Cuba in teaching English as a second language. So I think my time is probably running out, but I would like to say that we have to look in spite of the blockade, to intensify the cooperation. We in CARICOM, we need to be mindful that we need to give to Cuba. As Cuba extends to us, we must extend to Cuba as well. In fact, we are going to be proposing that over the next 12 months, that we have a very special period of people-to-people interactions and cooperation, intensified solidarity between CARICOM countries and Cuba. Over the next 12 months, we want as many CARICOM, every opportunity for our people to go, travel to Cuba, to support events and activities in Cuba. We will be proposing that we push forward with that. Finally, we think that the idea of setting up a task or several task forces for implementation, because sometimes we have good agreements. We have the Cuba CARICOM Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement, but sometimes we don't have the mechanisms in place to actually bring about the concrete results, and we are going to be looking at joint Barbados-Cuba task force on implementation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Commissioning. I would like to take the opportunity also to celebrate and commemorate, recognize the Independence Day of Barbados that was on November the 30th. So congratulations to you and to your country. And also I extend that congratulations to Dr. Kay-Ann Skitty, who is the next panelist, who is also joining from Barbados. As Ambassador explained, next week, the Cuba CARICOM Summit is going to take place in Barbados on December the 6th. I would like to introduce Dr. Kay-Ann Skitty, who is a Trade Research Fellow at the Susan Ramphal Center for International Trade, Law, Policy, and Services at the University of the West Indies in Cave Hill. Dr. Skitty lectures research methods for trade, trade aspects of regional integration, as well as CARICOM and the CSME. Her research interests include CARICOM's forward trade agenda, Caribbean regional integration, geopolitics, security studies, and regional governance systems. Dr. Skitty's recent publications include chapters on journal articles on Caribbean small states, regionalism, CARICOM diplomacy, artificial intelligence, and CARICOM's enlargement. She has worked across the Caribbean region as a trade consultant since 2009, and she has also been one of the most consistent researchers that attends the Caribbean International Conference that we celebrate at the University of Havana every December. So welcome and thank you very much, Dr. Kay-Ann Skitty, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. LaGuardia. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And before I share my PowerPoint, I just want to congratulate all the organizers from the Institute to the CARICOM Secretariat. And I am looking forward to celebrating Cuba this entire December, because from this next week, we are hosting an event on campus, an entire day, looking at CARICOM Cuba again. But then following that, I am heading off to University of Havana's annual conference in Cuba. And I'm so looking forward to being back there. Have not been there since 2019, but it's been a pleasure. And I look forward to sharing with you as we talk about the future. But before we go into the future, we have to talk about what exists. And what exists is an agreement that we have been trying to make the most of. But as Ambassador Commission pointed out several opportunities, I'm going to draw on some of those as well and elaborate on some more finer points that we as university academics and students and alum can perhaps start the ball rolling for 2023. So thank you again. So as I share my screen, the future of CARICOM-Cuban trade relations. As I said, there have been several instruments, but the main instrument that we will discuss and we will talk about trade surrounds the CARICOM-Cuba Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement, signed in 2000, but expanded in 2017, following several summits and joint commissions where the region and Cuba explore some of the challenges and further opportunities. So essentially, it was signed in 2000 to strengthen economic and commercial relations, and it surrounds several areas, from trade, tourism, trade promotion, business facilitation, human resources development, natural disaster preparedness, as well as science and technology. So it really speaks to that subject area of trade and economic cooperation. Now, when we look at the agreement, there are several trade in goods identified by lists, clearly outlining the duty-free treatment on at least 1,400 CARICOM products entering Cuba. And this was expanded in 2017 to a further 350 CARICOM products. Just a little bit of background about trade with CARICOM and Cuba. It has been skewed mainly in the favor of CARICOM more developing countries. So the Barbados, the Jamaica, the Guyana, the Suriname, the Belize, and their exports to Cuba. We have not had significant imports from Cuba, but we are hoping that as we progress more and we trade more, we should have a more favorable relationship, truth be told. But my presentation will talk about opportunities for both Cuba as well as CARICOM. So on your screen, you see the list of the 1,400 CARICOM products entering Cuba, duty-free as of 2000. And these are products that we consume, we see in our everyday manufacturers across the Caribbean, from the coconut oil, whether crude or refined, wheat and cereal products, rice, spices, melons, what we like to call papaya, or pawpaw, watermelon, vegetables, dairy products, meat and other meat offal products as well. The expansion included beer, rum, cement, and soap, as well as apparel. So it means then that several CARICOM businesses, several CARICOM manufacturers, they have an opportunity to look to Cuba as a potential market for their goods. Now, we all know that there are difficulties. And if you've been to Cuba, and I've been going to Cuba now, thanks to the Institute since 2007, 2008, Dr. Curtin would be able to elaborate more on that in terms of one of the first missions of students going to Cuba from the Institute. But we've had difficulties, and traders have also had difficulties. So according to Brown in 2014, several challenges include currency controls. And if you're like me, I'm based in Barbados and I'm traveling to Cuba in a couple of days, I've had to write to my central bank to get permission. And to get permission to purchase foreign exchange, not in US currency, but in euros and Canadian, because that is one of the those are the more easier currencies to use in Cuba. Traders have also experienced challenges as it relates to registration, information asymmetries, because as Professor Byron has put in the chat, several of us do not necessarily speak Spanish or fluently as we should. There's also a lack of transparency, the ability to plan purchases, as well as some export structures there to support Caribbean products coming into Cuba. So these difficulties existed in 2014, and some of them still exist, but a lot of them have been improved with the expansion of the agreement, with the introduction of the facilitation office in Cuba, as well as the many diplomatic missions in Cuba. But the high transportation and marketing costs will be one of the bigger challenges that I hope as a region we can overcome as we look to the future. And this is something that's been a bugbear for me. So I will talk a lot about this over the presentation, because I've been trying to travel within my region, and it is impossible. Because for me to get to Cuba from Barbados, I either need to go to Barbados, overnight in Trinidad, take a flight that's offered by Caribbean Airlines a specific day of the week to Cuba directly and back, or I go from Barbados to Panama, Panama to Cuba, or what I've chosen to do as the more efficient route. And I apologize to all regionalists out there. I am going to Florida and I'm transiting through Florida, and I am going to make that's more efficient of my time, because I leave Barbados at 8 and I get to Cuba by 4, all on one airline. Yeah, but it is via American Airlines through Florida. And that is something that upsets me to this day, because I know we've had the pandemic. We are gradually coming out of the pandemic as a region, but we have lost our ability to travel intra-regionally. And that is something that we need to fix immediately, because as much as countries talk, as much as countries create agreement, people and businesses trade. And we need the ability to move by transportation options. So I hope that for the region, we can look forward to seeing whether cargo options or maritime options or some other airline options that would allow us to really move our people and our goods to Cuba and around the region. All right, that's my rant finish. All right, so a snapshot of some of the CARICOM businesses who have overcome the transport challenges within Cuba. We have seen the major players, so the Anson McCalls, the Grace Kennedys, definitely, but we have seen several Trinidadian businesses. So Trinidad has what I like to call a key success factor for Trinidad and Tobago in terms of really getting its trading off the ground with Cuba has been the establishment of the Trinidad and Tobago Trade Facilitation Office. That Trade Facilitation Office does yeoman service in terms of pushing the goods both ways. St. Lucia's Baron Foods, they exported their first container to Cuba in 2017. And I'll be frank, I understand that the average CARICOM business would not be able to carry a container, but what I would suggest is that business create cooperatives, or we can say, let us at least try to have 1 cubic foot in a container, 1 crate or one pallet, sorry, within a container so that we can continue the bills and they can share the container costs rather than having one large container. By a business, truth be told, the smaller businesses can pull together and share that one container. What I would love to see, more CARICOM missions taking advantage of the annual Havana International Fair. I know 2019 would have been a really big year where CARICOM had a significant presence at the International Fair, where you actually get to see what is on offer in Cuba and vice versa. The Caribbean Cement Company has resumed cement exports to Cuba, but that is questionable because looking at the research, it is showing that the data shows that their exports to Cuba was actually their exports to Guantanamo Bay in terms of exports to cement. But what I do want you to note is that Export TT and Trinidad and Tobago does consider Cuba to be an important commercial market, as well as a potential launching pad to other Latin American markets for Trinidadian goods. So when we look at Cuban exports, what is it that Cuba's trading? This image, and I apologize in advance, this was created by the Harvard Atlas. So I literally just copied their image because I think it does a good job in explaining in a not a boring way as to what the major imports and exports are. So for Cuba, 15.37% of their exports came with cigars and cigarettes. Notably, sugarcane and sucrose, what we in the Caribbean are getting out of in terms of the manufacturing of sugarcane, what we need vital for our rum. Cuba exports at least 12.97%, and this is for the year 2020. Zeroing in on what Cuba imports. Poultry, what we in the Caribbean relatively self-sufficient in. I can call Barbados, I can call Jamaica, and CARICOM has a regional plan where we're trying to reduce our actual imports of poultry from extra-regionally by increasing our production. And we do have manufacturers of poultry and poultry products, whether you call it nuggets or like chicken hot dogs, etc. They're talking about ramping up their production. We can look to Cuba as a potential market for our poultry. And it makes even more sense now that the CARICOM has created the infrastructure there to assess our poultry. Cuba also imported for 2020 significant corn, rice, legumes, and wheat. Automatically with the rice, I think of the producers within the CARICOM region, and now definitely with the legumes, definitely Belize. So one country that we have seen significant trade take off, and there's a potential for more trade to take off, is definitely between Belize and Cuba. But if we talk about developing a CARICOM breadbasket using Guyana, Suriname, and Belize, definitely we can talk about supplying Cuba with goods and services. And as I told you before, I don't necessarily expect it to be surveyed by major companies, but let's talk about clusters. Let's create those clusters and cooperatives that would be able to jointly meet a Cuban quota on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, so as to ensure that we get trade to take off. But on that same note, we needed transportation options as well. Zeroing in on the agriculture imports of Cuba, and I apologize for the color yellow, taken straight from Harvard Atlas. 20% of Cuba's agricultural imports is poultry. 10.53% corn, 9.94% milk, concentrated milk. We talk about dairy production in the Caribbean. Cuba can be a potential market for us. But what it calls for is simple. What I tell my students on a semester basis, we have to know what we are producing. We have to know what our capacity is to actually produce and what we can meet in terms of long-term supply. Looking at Cubans' chemical imports for 2020, we see soap, we see medicaments, we see packaging lids, serums, and vaccines, cleaning products. Automatically, I think of Trinidad and Tobago for the cleaning products, especially medicaments. We've seen some small developments within our region for the medicaments that I think it is a market that should be explored, and definitely so. So the way forward, first thing has to be trade missions. We cannot talk about trade across waters unless we're physically in the market. Let's have business-to-business missions. And my heart smiles when I heard Ambassador talk about 2023 as intensifying the people movement. between the region and Cuba, because I would like to see those smaller micro operations that make up the real MSMEs in our Caribbean. Those manufacturers of condiments, seasoning, mustards, ketchups, barbecue sauces, and not necessarily manufacturing on a large scale. But those smaller mom and pop operations, I would love for them to explore what they can offer to Cuba on a joint basis, on a cluster basis even. Because if you've been to Cuba, it is usually a challenge when you're in the restaurant and we're looking for condiments. And I am smiling at some of the persons on this call who we traveled to Cuba together. Also, we can explore opportunities to jointly manufacture pharmaceuticals as well as vaccines. There we have a win-win scenario with Cuba with the vaccines and the Caribbean with the pharmaceuticals, the medicaments. According to the Cubans Chamber in 2019, there are Cuban companies that are interested in trading within CARICOM. And they actually identified at least 15 countries in the areas of construction, agri-food, culture, medical and biotechnology, telecommunications, as well as industry. So they've been identified, but the key is to actually get you in market. And as I started, the way forward has to involve transportation. The image on your screen is actually from Rock in 2019, and that is the Empress of the Seas as it departed Havana's port in 2019 on the instruction of the Trump administration. Why can't we have cruise liners? Why can't we have other cargo vessels moving more frequently through our region to facilitate intra-regional trade so that we can then talk about facilitating intra-regional trade with Cuba? We need trade connectivity more and more. Trade and services is necessary, especially in the area of languages, and that's building on what Ambassador Commission has spoken about. And definitely we need to further consider our persons moving to talk about trade and services as it relates to tourism. And as I conclude, I must be sentimental. I'm in my office for a reason, because at the top of the screen, you should see an image. That image I got commissioned on the death of Professor Oyenafa, former Prime Minister of Barbados. And it is an image of Fidel Castro, Professor Norman Gervin, and former Prime Minister of Barbados, Oyenafa, in Cuba when the gentlemen were awarded significant Cuban honors. And one thing I have learned from traveling to Cuba is that I am very much Caribbean, and Cuba looks and promotes and encourages Caribbean integration more than any other territory I've ever visited. Dr. LaGuardia can tell you her mother is one of the most welcoming Cuban mothers ever, and she embraces all of us university students. And it feels as if you are at home, regardless of the language differences we have. Cuba is definitely a part of our Caribbean family. I think in the future, the next 50 years, I hope that we can welcome them as part of CARICOM's family. That's it for me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skiddy, for your presentation and remarks. Yes, we hope we will meet very soon personally in Havana after these years of the pandemic. And you're absolutely right. I know Caribbean scholars visiting Havana that carry their pepper sauce and even have left their pepper sauce in some restaurants to make sure they have it there once they return. So thank you so much for your remarks. And I would like to invite now our final panelist that is also a scholar and an expert that has a tremendous experience in Cuba issues by visiting Cuba also several times to exchange with colleagues at the University of Havana and other areas. I'm talking about Ms. Michelle Lowy, who is Senior Coordinator for Hemispheric and Bilateral Negotiations at the CARICOM Secretariat. She has over 20 years experience in international trade policy and trade negotiations. She coordinated CARICOM's participation in the free trade area of the Americas negotiations from 2001 up to 2004, and the negotiation for a CARICOM-Cuba trade and economic cooperation agreement in 2000, as well as the negotiations between CARICOM and Canada for a trade and development agreement from 2009 up to 2014. She is an adjunct senior lecturer in the Department of Government at the U.W.I in Mona campus, and she lectures there a final year undergraduate course in theory and practice of international negotiation. Please, Ms. Lowy, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here today, and welcome again to you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Dr. LaGuardia. And I'd like to add my own congratulations to the organizers of this webinar. And I must say how very pleased I am to be sharing the platform with such a distinguished panel. And I have thoroughly enjoyed all the presentations that have gone before me. Those presentations have chronicled a very rich history of political solidarity, of diplomatic relations, technical and economic cooperation between CARICOM and Cuba over the last 50 years. I wish I was going to be in Barbados. I could be in Barbados next week to celebrate with Dr. Skeet. I'll do so virtually. So my task is to provide some perspectives to chart the future for CARICOM-Cuba relationship. I intend to pull together some of the main points from the various presentations that went ahead of me. And I want to say, just to start, a disclaimer. These are my views and they do not represent the official position of the CARICOM Secretariat. So how do we chart a future CARICOM-Cuba relationship? And I want to say that this webinar is a very important starting point for that broad-based dialogue about charting the future relationship, because it's always very good to look back in order to look forward. Looking back allows us to appreciate and celebrate the achievements of the last 50 years. It allows us to use those achievements as building blocks to consolidate and strengthen the foundations for the next 50 years. So all of the speakers before me have highlighted what we need to celebrate, what we need to preserve, what we need to consolidate as we chart the future relationship. And if I dare say, they said we must celebrate and continue to nurture the strong political bonds through the biennial summit process and the meetings of CARICOM and Cuban ministers of foreign affairs. We must consolidate and deepen our collaboration and joint advocacy on critical issues of mutual interest. And we heard some of those critical issues. Climate change, but I also should add development financing. And we should advocate those and work together in advocating those issues in regional and international fora in which we both participate. There's CELAC, there's the ACS, there's the OACPS, and the SIDS grouping. And we must expand and strengthen the technical cooperation programs in the areas of health, agriculture, education, and human resource development, construction, sports, disaster risk reduction and mitigation. But I hasten to say that even as we celebrate these achievements, we cannot ignore the challenges which have faced the relationship over the past 50 years. And Ambassador Commission pointed to some of those challenges. And some of those challenges arise from externalities over which CARICOM and Cuba have no control. But I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that there are factors internal to CARICOM and Cuba which have impacted the relationship and minimized the successes in some areas. I think it's true to say that we haven't maximized fully the opportunities for cooperation under the technical cooperation agreements and the memoranda of understanding that we have, memoranda of understanding which we have signed over the years. Many of these remain unimplemented. On the trade and investment front, Dr. Skeet very eloquently and passionately laid out for us the record in terms of the performance in terms of trade. it is true that the parties have not taken advantage of the market access and economic cooperation opportunities which were provided by the Trade and Economic Cooperation Agreement concluded in 2000. It is something of a concern to me that the agreement and the second protocol signed in 2017 are yet to enter into force. So in looking forward to the future relationship, I think the upcoming 8th CARICOM Cuba Summit in Barbados presents a very good opportunity for leaders to establish an action agenda for charting and energizing this future relationship. And again, I think Ambassador Commission and Dr. Skeet have outlined a slew of priorities for trade and technical cooperation that can feature on this action agenda. Certainly for Ambassador Commission, he identified actions which were probably specific to the bilateral relationship between Barbados and Cuba. But certainly a number of those agenda and priorities can be escalated to the broader CARICOM-Cuba relationship. And in identifying those priorities and that agenda, I think we must be strategic. We have to be strategic in prioritizing the issues on the agenda in order to meet mutual interests and common objectives of building economic resilience as well as environmental resilience of CARICOM countries and Cuba. And I think it's going to be very important as a first step towards developing that action agenda and rolling out that action agenda to revitalize the Joint Commission, the CARICOM-Cuba Joint Commission, established in 1993 as a forum for technical and economic cooperation. And dare I say, I think heads should mandate the officials to establish an action plan for driving that agenda forward. Having said that, what are the candidates from my perspective in terms of the priorities for that agenda? And we've heard them listed by our speakers that went before me. Food security. I think food security is a common concern for CARICOM and for Cuba. And certainly in the face of the rising food prices and global food shortages, we should prioritize and deepen technical cooperation in agriculture. And that cooperation can feature initiatives that support CARICOM's 25 by 2025 initiative. And it can also support the agricultural reform process that is taking place in Cuba to achieve a reduction in our import bills, our food import bills. That agricultural cooperation may require us to revisit some of the draft cooperation agreements on agriculture and SPS matters, which Cuba presented to CARICOM in the context of the Joint Commission. And we should explore opportunities, I think, to enhance agricultural yields through using the technology. To drive that kind of cooperation in agriculture, I think it's going to be important to establish and institutionalize a dialogue between ministers of agriculture of CARICOM and of Cuba, similar to how we have organized meetings of CARICOM and Cuban foreign ministers of foreign affairs. The other agenda item for me, priority for the agenda, would be to strengthen and increase technical cooperation on climate change, including climate resilience. We're talking about protection of the environment, also how to sustainably use the resources of the Caribbean Sea and the blue economy, which is a common resource for both CARICOM countries and Cuba. And of course, there is the vexed issue of energy resilience and energy security built into that whole framework in terms of looking at renewable energy resources. I think it's going to also be important as part of charting the future relationship to deepen our collaboration in the area of culture. I think it's going to be important to mainstream cultural diplomacy into the future relationship. We should take advantage of the numerous opportunities to broaden collaboration in the creative industries. And we should leverage the upcoming CARIFesta 15 in Antigua and Barbuda as a platform for deepening the collaboration in this area. I think it was Ambassador Commission who mentioned the Caribbean Regional School of the Arts. I think we should take the positive steps to establish that regional school. I think it's supposed to be located in Jamaica. And the establishment of that school would be a tangible expression of the collaboration. Now I come to my favorite part, the trade and investment front. And before I go to the trade and investment front, the priorities I have mentioned for the agenda are in addition to what is already in place. So it would be building upon a substructure of cooperation that already exists as it relates to health, education, human resource development, construction, sports, and disaster risk reduction and mitigation. But I believe that those areas that I mentioned, agriculture, environment, cultural diplomacy, are key to be prioritized as part of this action agenda. So I come to my favorite area, and it relates to the trade and investment front. Notwithstanding the many challenges, and Dr. Skeet outlined the challenges and the difficulties as it relates to trading with Cuba. Notwithstanding those challenges, I think we have to redouble our efforts to mainstream trade and economic cooperation into the future relationship. I think it's critical. It's not only critically important, but it's necessary, especially if we want to build economic resilience in the current global context. And as Cuba continues on the path towards economic modernization and gradual incorporation into the global economy, it is true that new trade and investment opportunities will open it up in sectors in which both CARICOM countries and Cuba have comparative advantage. And Dr. Skeet has identified some of those opportunities. So for me, the future relationship, there must be deliberate steps taken to foster a commercial diplomacy as an integral pillar of the future relationship. And we should encourage the business interests in CARICOM and Cuba to use the trade agreement to build the foundations to support that commercial diplomacy. We need to encourage the private sector leaders to reactivate the CARICOM Cuba Business Council, which is provided for under the CARICOM Cuba Trade Agreement as a vehicle to promote trade and establish business contacts. And here we now have regional private sector organizations and leaders such as the CPSO, the CARICOM Private Sector Organization. We also have the Network of Caribbean Chambers of Commerce, CARICOM, and we have the Caribbean Manufacturers Association. These can take the lead on behalf of CARICOM. I think it's going to be important as well for our members of governments to take action to bring into force the agreement so that we can take full advantage of the additional market access that was negotiated in 2017. To date, I think only two CARICOM countries would have ratified that additional protocol. And as Dr. Skeet indicated, that second protocol opens up opportunities in a whole slew of new areas. 350 product lines ready to be opened up and accessed by CARICOM exporters. And I think once we bring the agreement into force, we also need to take quick steps to establish and activate some of the experts groups that have been established under the agreement. For example, there are expert groups on trade financing, experts group on transportation, which were intended to start developing work programs immediately way back in 2001, shortly after the agreement was concluded and signed. The agreement also provides for arrangements to facilitate business. For example, the Joint Commission under the agreement was mandated to meet within 30 days of entry into force to adopt a special program of measures for the facilitation of business, including measures designed to achieve and maintain transparency and to encourage information exchange and also to harmonize customs, procedures, and technical standards. This agreement was negotiated way back in 2000 before we concluded the trade facilitation agreement in the WTO. CARICOM and Cuba are parties to that agreement. And there are opportunities under that agreement to, notwithstanding the status of this agreement, this trade agreement, there are opportunities under the WTO agreement on trade facilitation, which both CARICOM and Cuba can use to enhance cooperation to bring about business facilitation measures. Ambassador Commission made the very good point that all CARICOM countries have diplomatic and consular presence in Cuba. And he also said that Cuba has an embassy in all CARICOM countries. And we can use those missions to bolster trade and investment promotion by establishing trade attaches or trade facilitation offices in all the CARICOM embassies in Havana, similar to the Trinidad and Tobago Trade Facilitation Office, which was established in 2000. And as Dr. Skeet said, that kind of institutionalization of the commercial diplomacy in the embassies and in our missions could drive the organization of the trade fairs, the trade missions, and you know, just create increased business to business contacts. But there are trade and economic cooperation opportunities in areas beyond the trading goods. And there are massive potential, there's massive potential in the expansion of trade and services, which accounts for the most dynamic sectors in CARICOM, and in particular, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. I can point to, for example, professional services. Several of our professionals and our architects, dentists, doctors, nurses, teachers were trained in Cuba. So the foundation for trade and collaboration as it relates to professional services exists. And a lot of those persons who are trained in Cuba, happily, are fluent in Spanish. I think there's also quite a lot of opportunity as it relates to cultural and entertainment services, construction services, port and logistics services. I mean, we can build on the synergies which are provided by the Mariel Port in Cuba and Jamaica's, the thrust in Jamaica over the last couple of years to develop a logistics hub. How can we use those opportunities to build synergies for broadening trading services and collaboration and services? And then I come to tourism. And in tourism, we can speak about not just investment in the hotel stock, but we're talking about as well expanding the existing marketing arrangements for multi-destination tourism. And here I think we need to take positive steps to implement the MOU on multi-destination tourism, which was signed at the last CARICOM Cuba Summit in December 2017. Well, in the sixth CARICOM Cuba Summit in December 2017. I think there are also synergies arising as it relates to health and medical tourism. Perhaps we could even look at sports tourism. I want to wrap up here because I think I've been going for a little while, and to make one final point about charting the future relationship. I think the agenda must create a space for deliberate engagement of and exchanges among the youth of CARICOM and Cuba. I don't think we can go, I don't think we can go forward into the 21st century building only on relying on the strong political friendships and political solidarity that characterized and drove the relationship 50 years ago. While those strong political relationships and solidarity will continue to feature prominently, I'm sure, I think we need to, at least I am quite clear that there's a new and emerging generation of young Cuban and CARICOM citizens and future leaders who have no connection with or appreciation of the geopolitical realities and the imperatives that gave birth to the relationship 50 years ago. For them, the embargo and the revolution is a story best told by professors. They have not lived that reality, and therefore I think the future relationship must create a deliberate space for youth diplomacy to allow the views and the priorities of the next generation to flavor the relationship in a deliberate way. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lowy, for your excellent presentation. Before going to the question and answer, I would like to take the opportunity again to recognize the fantastic contributions we have had so far that covered the background of the relationship between Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. And also very important, not only have identified the success and how this relationship has improved over the years, but most important, we have had discussion so far in terms of what are the challenges and the key areas that both parts should be looking in terms of expanding and going deeper in terms of having a more solid and close relationship. So I would like to thank and appreciate the contributions you have done so far. I would like also to notice that in a symbolic perspective, we might see the 4 countries that started the relationship with Cuba represented today in this panel. Definitely we have Guyana, we have Barbados, we have of course, Jamaica, and here we are hosting this webinar from the Institute of International Relations based in St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. So also in a symbolic way, I'm really happy to see these 4 countries that were the pioneers in establishing the relationship, being also having representatives that are pioneering this discussion that I hope we will continue next week in Cave Hill, as Dr. Skiddy has indicated. They are hosting a very important event also in Cuba CARICOM relations, and most important, the 8th Cuban CARICOM Summit. So having said that, I have received several questions. I propose to get at least 2 or 3 rounds of questions. I will read a first set of questions, and then I will invite the panelists to react to them. First, I have here a very important, interesting comment by Professor Byron that has indicated that the Cuban government and people have made an immeasurable contribution to the human and economic development of the Caribbean region, strengthening our health sector, our education sector, and providing opportunities for professional development of thousands of young Caribbean people who would not otherwise have the chance to become health professionals, engineers, etc. One knows that most of these individuals have gone on to become leaders of various kinds in their countries and the wider society. Many of our diplomats in Latin America are Cuban-trained, fluent Spanish speakers who help to strengthen the bridge between the English-speaking Caribbean and the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. truth to tell, our countries have reciprocated mainly in terms of political support, but we could do so much more to support and integrate Cuba more meaningfully using the experience of the last 50 years to expand and deepen the cooperation and mobility. So in that regard, also Professor Byron is asking on how the Cuban graduates could fuel this process. I believe that Ambassador Commission was already giving some hints, at least from the Barbados perspective. And other question that I have here has to do with how could the CARICOM Cuban cooperation help and contribute to the tremendous current challenge that is presently faced in Haiti, considering Haiti as a CARICOM member state and the strong relationship that has joined Cuba and Haiti in the past and also in the present. Could you talk, I'm talking now to the panelists, about some initiative or some steps that could be promoted in this relationship, by this relationship of Cuban CARICOM, specifically looking at Haiti and how to help the situation in Haiti today. So I will add another question also to this first round that has to do with climate change and mitigation and adaptation. It was mentioned by you, but it has been shared in the chat that during the next years, what could be some areas for CARICOM Cuba to join their knowledge, economic and other resources, specifically to target the climate threats and environmental threats. So I will leave these three first areas to reaction from you. First, Cuban graduates fueling the process of bringing together and expanding Cuba-CARICOM relationship. Second, how could Cuba and CARICOM relationship work together? What initiative could be taken to help Haiti in its current situation? And third, Cuba and CARICOM relationship working and moving forward to build climate resilience and to work in the environmental field. So any reaction in these three areas of that first round, please, I open the floor to the panelists to react.
Maybe I could say something about the about Haiti. CARICOM has the ambition to play a significant role in helping Haiti to move out of the crisis situation it is currently in. And right now, that is a matter that is consuming a lot of CARICOM's attention. CARICOM feels strongly that we could play a role in helping the various parties in Haiti to come to some kind of national consensus about the way forward. Because without that national consensus about the way forward, it is going to be very difficult to do anything that is truly meaningful, to make any intervention from outside of Haiti that is truly meaningful. And once we get past that hurdle, CARICOM does have ambitions to play a role in helping Haiti in terms of the electoral system, making preparation for new elections, helping Haiti in institutional building in various aspects, putting our various CARICOM institutions to work in helping to build capacity in Haiti. And of course, there would be many opportunities for collaboration with our Cuban brothers and sisters in these various spheres. As we know, Cuba has played a big role in Haiti in the medical arena. Over the years, Cuba has sent medical teams, permanent medical teams into Haiti to help provide medical sources. But the difficulty is to get for CARICOM to embark upon that process of facilitating a national Haitian dialogue to get that consensus. So that is what we are currently working on now. What is the best way to accomplish that? And hopefully that will become much clearer in a couple of weeks' time. Yes, the Cuban graduates could always play a bigger role. We could engage them more. Our feeling in Barbados is that Cuba is in a very difficult situation at the present. It's in a very difficult situation because of the confluence of the Trump tightening of the embargo, the blockade, the Cuba being placed on the list of state sponsors of terrorism, the pandemic, the cost of living increase caused by the war in Ukraine, global, all of the crises that have impacted. They've really impacted very heavily in Cuba because Cuba is under blockade. And so we see the need for a special program, a special effort that CARICOM should make over the next 12 months to really up the ante in our solidarity with Cuba, to participate in as many of the activities based in Cuba, the conferences, the meetings, to encourage student visits. And of course, there would be a big role for Cuban graduates who already know the terrain to play in that kind of program. Climate change, yes, Barbados, CARICOM is really in the vanguard of pushing climate change efforts to respond to the climate crisis. And we should all be very conscious that many, many years before this was a quote unquote sexy topic, Fidel and the Cuban government were speaking about this. They were trying to alert the world to a burgeoning climate crisis, and in fact, a confluence of several crises coming together to form a systemic crisis of our global civilization. So it's a no-brainer that CARICOM and Cuba will collaborate in this response to the climate crisis. That's it from me.
Thank you, Ambassador. Commissioning. Somebody else from the panel would like to react to these three first areas, any of them?
Well, I would say briefly, in the first instance, to be brutally frank, I am disappointed in CARICOM's reaction to Haiti. As a matter of fact, I'm disappointed that as a member of CARICOM, countries, including my own, have imposed visa restrictions on entry to the country by Haitian nationals. I think that CARICOM ought to rework and refocus on bringing Haiti directly into its focus, directly into its sphere of operations. I don't think that having allowed for Haitian membership and participation, that it could be selective in its approach. I think Haiti is in a situation now which demands some levels of intervention by CARICOM as a collective, especially in relation to its people, the Haitian people. We see where there are issues related to food shortages. There's a resurgence of communicable diseases. And so there should be the immediate establishment of a task force in CARICOM. And indeed include Cuban experience to engage directly with the people of that country. In relation to this, I would say the citizen-to-citizen engagement, I believe that indeed there's a need for greater interaction among youth of CARICOM with those of Cuba. We have started years ago, and I'm sure you could attest to that, Dr. Skeet, about our participation and interaction at the level of student with academic and lecturer participation from the IIR. As a matter of fact, I recall, and I think it still may be the largest number ever taken to Cuba by U.W.I. We had 60 students go to Cuba for that period, for the period of the conference and interacting generally with the Cuban populace. And I think much more of that has to be done. There must be, first of all, at the student level in tertiary institutions, interchange of students for Spanish, English kind of exchange programs. NGOs and other community groups should really be engaged in citizen diplomacy, as I call it. And I hear that over the last 12 months or the next 12 months, there will be some sustained engagement. And I find that very encouraging. And I trust that that will, will not be part of the implementation deficit that we face in this region. In terms of climate change and disaster preparedness, I have seen the Cuban experience, or the experience of Cuban authorities in dealing with issues of climate change events, issues of disasters, emergency. And I would advocate for higher levels of collaboration with SEDEMA and with other agencies in the Caribbean that could structure very strategic engagements and plans, because I think we are in for the long haul in relation to disaster management. We've seen, as I say, the intensity and regularity of climate change action that is impacting our small states. And I believe that the broadening of the linkage would be important as we tackle those environmental and climate change issues. And that'd be my first reaction.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kirton. I have another set of questions that I believe could be addressed particularly to Dr. Skiri and Ms. Lowy, because they are dealing with trade and transport and economics. Well, I have an interesting suggestion and question made by on the chat by Donny Ramsudar, that talks about a proposal of building a highway or land to sea bridge linking Havana to the Florida Keys and to the island of the Caribbean and also to Venezuela in order to accommodate easier trade and shipping of goods and services in the future. So that question could be like a provocation for the panelists to react on how to ameliorate the transport deficit that we still have in the region and that you have very clearly identified. A second question also in the area of trade and services, it has to do with what about cultural products? Cuban artisanry is first class, and this is a comment by Professor Byron, and Professor Byron indicates that she regrets not seeing many more of the leather bags or many other products available in our countries. What is the possibility for cultural trade? What could be your suggestions and comments on that? And a third question that I open to all panelists as well has to do with the role of China. China becoming a financial partner for Cuba and CARICOM. Do you see, and this is a question by Claire Alarid, what are China's cultural and diplomatic ties with Cuba and CARICOM? And I could add, if you could see some type of triangular type of South-South cooperation involving China, Cuba, and some Caribbean states, not necessarily CARICOM, because we already know that there are countries, CARICOM member states that do not have diplomatic relationship with China. So this is also something to think about. So I will open the floor to our panelists for this second round of question and comments. And please, who would like to react?
I can. Oh, Miss Lowe, sorry. Sorry. Thank you. You're my guest, so I gotta make sure you're comfortable. All right. Problem. All right, awesome. Many thanks for the questions. First thing, to the question about the lab bridge, I salute you. That's what some of the innovation that I have been pushing. I often tell my students that when you leave the University of West Indies, I want you to think creatively outside of the box. Look around the rest of the world and build on their examples. And what we can learn from China, build a land bridge. China has built one of the longest sea bridges connecting parts of China. Now, I know there are environmentalists among you who will tell you about the coral reefs and everything else in the seabed, but as a trade analyst, I like to say we have to give something to get something. We can stand from several of our countries in the Eastern Caribbean and see the landmass. You can see the cars on the opposite side. Sorry, why is it that we do not have connectivity in the form of a physical bridge? I would love to see the day where there is a physical bridge connecting at least several of the Caribbean islands where we can have 24-hour trade, where goods and people can move. We are not limited by boundaries. I would absolutely love to see that land bridge. And I think for me, the role of China is exactly there. China's One Belt, One Road initiative across the globe is one that connects countries. And I think if the Caribbean, as we come together as CARICOM and we approach China as a region, it is something that we can propose. And I know we are being wishful and we are being optimistic. And I know there are all the other geopolitical implications out there, as Dr. LaGuardia had mentioned, that there are some countries who are not pro-China and they're more towards Taiwan, but this has to be a regional initiative for the greater good of the community. And I think that this One Belt, One Road initiative can build such a development in the Caribbean, not necessarily in the first decade of our lifetime. It may be 2-3 decades down the road, but we can start the conversation there. As it relates to trade and cultural products and services, I am all for that. And I, truth be told, Cuban's arts is, I have not seen art close to Cuba outside of Haitian arts in terms of the quality of the arts. And we have a lot in the Eastern Caribbean to learn from Cuban practitioners. And I think we have benefited from, because we have, well, I can only speak of Barbados and the U.W.I campus here, Cave Hill, but our artists are predominantly Cuban. We have Cuban dancers. I want to teach our students dance and the theory of dance and the practice of dance, etc. And we have Cuban artists here among us. So I think that we can definitely benefit from increasing trade in cultural products and services. And Ms. Lowe's, when she mentioned CARIFESTA, I would hope that CARICOM would express an invitation to Cuba to definitely bring a large delegation to CARIFESTA in Antigua. Over to you, Ms. Lowe.
Thank you very much, Kaya and Dr. Speed. I don't want to repeat much of what Dr. Skeet said, because I do support much of what she has said in terms of the enthusiasm, in terms of what is needed. In terms of a practical plan of action, I think the opportunities for triangular cooperation in the area of transportation is those opportunities need to be actively pursued. And in that regard, I want to point to the ACS work program, Association of Caribbean States. The work program, front and center on that work program is transportation, regional transportation. So I do believe that in the context of the ACS, there are those opportunities for triangular cooperation to see how we can move forward to address the whole transportation issue and to address all of those structural and connectivity blockages that stymie the relationship. In terms of Cuba, in terms of China, I do believe that a lot of the China CARICOM relationship may best be pursued at the bilateral level because of the differences in terms of the diplomatic relations. You know, there are quite a few countries in the region that have established relationships with diplomatic relationships with Taiwan as opposed to mainland China. And therefore, the development of what you would call a CARICOM, Cuba, China triangular type of cooperation is frustrated by that. But you know, I'm bringing my policy approach to this. I think I need to take that hat off and put on my academic hat and say, yes, let's do it. As it relates to the cultural products, trading cultural products, I think that we have to build from the ground up. And it's not, and exchange, we should seek to have the mutual exchanges. So yes, Cuban artistry and Cuban artisan products and cultural products are rich. I have many paintings in my house, but we equally have, you know, a lot of Caribbean artisans that we need to showcase. How do we take advantage of that? Can we use these trade fairs, these trade missions, you know, to bring CARICOM artists and artisans to Havana, expose them to the sort of quality products I have seen in Havana, but equally to expose Cuban artisans as well to some of the very rich cultural products that we have in the region. So I do believe that CARIFESTA can provide a nice avenue opening. And yes, I'd like to see a big Cuban contingent there. But there is also the Caribbean Regional School for the Arts, Performing Arts, that has been mooted. And I think that those two initiatives would go a long way in developing the groundwork, Dr. Barron, for building, you know, on that trade in cultural goods and the creative industries. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Skiddy and Ms. Louie. Related to that point about cultural trade and services, we have a comment from Professor Byron that states that the Cuba CARICOM Friendship Societies in certain islands used to organize trips and tours. And there was a tremendous demand, untapped demand on Caribbean people to travel to Cuba. But usually they want to go in organized groups because most of them do not speak Spanish. So that could be an interesting, I believe, proposal for travel agencies in the Caribbean to explore the market of tourism in Cuba and also allow for that, not only tourism, but cultural exchange as well. So if there is someone from the private sector and the tourist industry listening to this webinar, this is a tip for you to explore. I have another comment here from Dr. Ruben Martorello that is joining from Suriname, and he says that the biggest challenge in establishing or improving trade with Cuba are the absence of financial and structural mechanism to facilitate transaction and the possible blacklisting of companies part of the U.S. blockade undertaking trade with Cuba. What is being done jointly by CARICOM countries to address this challenge? I will open this question to all of the panelists if you would like to react to it.
I think people have to be realistic. CARICOM can only do so much. CARICOM can try. I think CARICOM has been trying. Ultimately, the United States is the big power. The United Nations votes every year to condemn the blockade and to call for its removal. And the United States flouts the legal opinion of the world community and ignores the United Nations General Assembly resolutions. CARICOM has intervened with US policymakers on several occasions, making the point for the removal of the blockade. I am certain that when the CARICOM delegates attended the recent Summit of the Americas in Los Angeles, that would have been a message they carried to the US President and Vice President. As I said, CARICOM has written personally to the US President. But we need to be realistic. CARICOM is not a superpower. Looking at the issue of Haiti, Barbados removed the visa requirements for Haitians to enter Barbados. Within a few months, Barbados, as much as it did not want to reimpose the visa requirements, it had no choice. So many Haitians were coming into Barbados. There were 2 flights from Panama into Barbados. Haitians were coming up all the way from Chile. 90, almost all the seats on the plane, on the Copa planes into Barbados were Haitians. Eventually, a lot of them were coming, no support structure, falling into difficult times on the streets of Barbados. And eventually your own people begin to react. And something that was supposed to be positive then becomes very negative and has the potential to sour people-to-people relations. So small Caribbean countries have to be realistic. They can do so much. And so it just makes no sense just to stand back and and say they should be doing X, Y, and Z. That they may well be trying their best, and what you're demanding may be beyond their capacity. But having said that, the key thing in the CARICOM-Cuba relationship is CARICOM solidarity to bring about a termination of that blockade. That blockade has done and continues to do a lot of damage to Cuba. When we had CARIFESTA in Barbados in 1981, Cuba sent a ship to Barbados, a ship full of artists, musicians, books. That ship anchored off the coast of Barbados, and by far the biggest delegation to CARIFESTA in 1981 was the Cuban delegation. Whole bands, Irakere, Casa de las Americas. A lot of my introduction to Cuban literature were books that I purchased in CARIFESTA 1981. You know, last time we held CARIFESTA in Barbados, again Cuba was invited, but the delegation was much smaller, reflecting some of the difficulties caused by the blockade, you know. So I just think that we have to be very realistic. We can talk about building a land bridge. I don't know how are you going to build a land bridge to the Florida Keys when the United States is blockading Cuba. So I think we have to be very realistic and very strategic in how we go forward and try to build this relationship, and for CARICOM countries to do the best we can to play a helpful and constructive role, especially targeting that blockade or getting Cuba off that U.S. State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism. So I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm just trying to say that we need to be very realistic in our approach to these issues.
Thank you, Ambassador Commissioner. And I see that Ms. Lowy would like to speak. Before I'm inviting Ms. Lowy to react, I would like to say that next week on December the 8th, the Institute of International Relations will have a webinar about the Haitian situation. So we would like to invite all of you to join us next week, because we could be exploring and having a deeper discussion in the current situation in Haiti. So having said that, please, Ms. Lowy.
Thank you very much, Dr. LaGuardia. I wanted to address the question with respect to the absence of financial infrastructure and mechanisms to facilitate financial transactions, which have been stymieing the trade relationship. The difficulties in doing business with Cuba have been documented by our traders, you know, and in 2009, I recall, Trinidad and Tobago, the Export-Import Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, and the Central Bank of Cuba were in discussions to establish a line of credit. So lines of credit have been, and credit instruments have been one avenue that at least one member state, Trinidad and Tobago, has tried to pursue to support its businesses and their traders doing business in Cuba. I'm not sure that that line of credit was actually finalized, but certainly it gives an idea of the kind of instruments that would be required. And that was in 2009. There have been openings since then, and I'm sure reforms which perhaps could make it easier to negotiate such instruments, credit instruments going forward. But the important thing, I think, is to recognize where the difficulties lie and develop the kinds of action plans, bringing in the private sector, the business sector. And this is where I want to reiterate what I said about the future relationship. That commercial diplomacy has to be driven by the business sector, the business interests in both the Caribbean and in CARICOM and Cuba. As a former boss of mine would say, you know, countries don't trade, it's firms that trade. Countries negotiate the rules and the parameters that allow traders the space to take advantage of trade opportunities. So we really do need to create a deliberate, build a deliberate commercial diplomacy into that future relationship to begin to address those kinds of problems. Because, you know, we keep on saying that we want to be first movers when Cuba opens up. Cuba is opening, and there's gonna come a day when everybody recognizes, hey, Cuba is open for business a long time ago, and there are businesses ahead of us. So I think that we really need to start working at it and trying to find these business solutions. And I certainly don't know the business solutions. It's business people who know the business solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Lowy. Please, Dr. Skid, I can see your hand raised up, so please.
Thank you so much. As it relates to trading, in Barbados, we have absolutely strict foreign exchange controls, and we've liberalized them to an extent, but they're still in place. But you can still, we still facilitate trade. So generally, when you're leaving the country, you leave with the United States currency. But if you're going to Cuba and you made the point that you're going to Cuba, they allow you to purchase euros or Canadian. And for me, that's a plus because they are facilitating your movement and your ability to function when you land in Cuba and your ability to trade when you're operating in Cuba. I want to make the point in Haiti, and Haiti will always be one of the bugbears for the Caribbean. But if we're going to go to the point of CARICOM taking Haiti side and ensuring that we bring to the agenda Haiti's concern, for me, one of those has to be the immediate ceasing of the US's claim to Haiti's Navassa Island. Because Navassa Island is rightly Haitian, and it contains the biodiversity necessary for, I guess, all human existence, but it is something that I think the US needs to immediately stop. CARICOM, as all regional movements, and I will end on this point, is a big family. And I will always remember Professor Gervin saying, Can, in everything, in all families, you will have points where you do not want to be family, but you're still family, and we will still come to the table, and we will still move forward together as family. I think there needs to be more opportunities like this, where we bring to the fore and open up the issues. We talk about the challenges, but we leave them with the dreams and the optimism. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I believe that Dr. Skiddy's intervention has resumed perfectly the spirit that I would like us to take also from this discussion. I will end the question and answer session now. I believe we are pretty much near the end of the time we have. I would like to recognize, before moving forward, the vote of thanks, the company, and to acknowledge Ambassador Donna Ford, the Assistant Secretary General of Foreign and Community Relations in CARICOM, who has been very instrumental and has supported tremendously this initiative. So thank you so much, Ambassador Ford, for being with us this evening. I don't know if you would like to take 1 or 2 minutes to address the audience. Otherwise, I know we will meet you in other opportunities.
Yeah, thank you, Jacqueline. Just use the opportunity to say that I welcome this collaboration with the Institute. And on a personal note, I can say with great confidence to Dr. Skeet that I lived through everything that you spoke about for 8 years as Barbados's first resident ambassador to Cuba. So I understand very clearly your passion and what you think about why we have to do more. Certainly as CARICOM, now that I am on the CARICOM side, having been on, just like you and just like others who wonder why we are not getting more done. I just want to say thank you very much to the Institute for this opportunity to collaborate, because it's important that we do that we have these kinds of discussions, but also the Institute is playing a very important role in not only in creating the opportunities for this type of discussion, but and I'm hoping that out of this, we can have more collaborations that can feed into the kind of policy analysis and research that we need to help to inform our own policy making. And that's and Michelle spoke quite eloquently of that in her presentation. I'm also happy for the opportunity I was also happy to the opportunity to listen to Dr. Curtin, as well as my colleague and friend, Ambassador Commichong. And I too join him in paying tribute to Ambassador Cabezas, who certainly laid a lot of the foundation for the important relationship established over the past 50 years between CARICOM and Cuba. So it is now up to us, up to the people of the Caribbean community and up to the Caribbean institutions to ensure that we continue to lay the basis for the relationship between Cuba and the Caribbean to continue. So just those few words, but I am optimistic, even with all of the structural challenges that that we all spoke about. When I lived in Cuba, I saw how little by little you can chip away and get things done. And if there's one thing that you can say about the Cuban people are resilient. It's tough to have to constantly describe people as resilient when they're resilient only because the conditions are being made more difficult by the structural difficulties that they face. But that's where CARICOM can also play a role with some of the partnerships that Ambassador Commichong has spoken about. And the example of Barbados, which is also looking to engage in partnerships with Cuba, rather than only being on the receiving end of the Cuban Technical Corporation. That's a good model, and that's a model upon which we all can build. And so just those, perhaps more than few words, I thank you, and I thank you for the opportunity to collaborate.
Thank you, Ambassador Ford. I would like now to invite for the formal vote of thanks, because we are 3 minutes out of our time, but I'm sure that you will indulge us with a few minutes to allow Ms. Adriel Charles, who is Master of Science in Global Science, a student at the Institute of International Relations, to deliver the formal vote of thanks to this, I believe, wonderful session we have had this afternoon. Please, Ms. Adriel.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Dr. Montoot, Interim Director, Institute of International Relations, Ambassador Donna Ford, Assistant Secretary General, Foreign and Community Relations, CARICOM Secretariat, other distinguished panelists, guests, U.W.I staff, and other fellow students. I thank you for the opportunity to present the vote of thanks at this auspicious event. Special thanks to Ambassador Donna Ford for kickstarting this program with your welcome remarks, as well as facilitating this collaboration between the CARICOM and the Institute of International Relations. Thank you to Dr. Ambassador Piedra for presenting the history of Cuba and the journey they have experienced in different periods of their national development. His Excellency Ambassador Commission, thank you for expanding on the challenges Cuba faced due to international interference and their strategies to overcome despite adversity. Dr. Curtin and Skeet, thank you for your passion as you shared on the industries Cuba are involved in within the CARICOM network. You described the regional challenges as well as emphasize the solutions, enforcing meaningful policy to further deepen the ties of integration. Ms. Lowe, your practical strategies on economic and environmental resilience encourage reflection on the political will and action of regional leaders. Again, you've emphasized the common thread for the need of diplomacy and cooperation in the political implementation of resilience strategies. As we celebrate Cuba, these conversations are necessary in discussing where we are and collaboratively charting our way forward. As a student of global studies, these conversations are so important in developing appreciation for this field. I wish to express my sincerest gratitude for presenting the geopolitical context of Cuba-CARICOM relations and reigniting my desire to be a part of CARICOM diplomacy. Gertrude Stein has a great quote that reads, "Silent gratitude isn't much to anyone." This event especially would not be possible without the persons behind the scenes who diligently work to ensure this webinar move from idea to reality. Dr. Jacqueline LaGuardia Martinez, under whose leadership this webinar was organized, and also my lovely lecturer, Ms. Zara Weeks-Reiser, for performing the administrative work to organize this event, Professor Jessica Byron, former director of the Institute of International Relations, for her valuable and intellectual and other inputs, and Ms. Crystal Citroen for research support. Last but not least, thank you to the IIR Secretariat and U.W.I Marketing for facilitating the technicalities of this event. I conclude by saying thank you to all for the enlightening presentations, engaging questions, and an evening well spent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Charles. And with this vote of thanks, I give the final, I believe, goodbye to all of you. I would like to thank again everyone that has enthusiastically responded to our invitations and the attendees that have also joined the session and have interacted with us. So thanks again. See you in next webinars organized by the Institute of International Relations with the assistance of CARICOM, and have a pleasant evening, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.